Hi, I'm Chris McNulty, Senior Product Manager for SharePoint and OneDrive at Microsoft. Over the past decade, as part of digital transformation, organizations have increasingly turned to the cloud to help manage their burgeoning arsenal of digital content. Content has always been king, but as we've seen organizations move from petabytes to zettabytes and beyond, struggling with this is expected to be a challenge for years to come. However, many organizations have learned greatly from patterns of the past. That's why today Microsoft is joined by three visionaries from the world of content. Today we have John Mancini, Chairman Emeritus of AIIM, Cheryl McKinnon, Principal Analyst at Forrester Research, and Ian Story, Principal Program Manager for Microsoft. So John, welcome.
Good to be here, Chris.
Tell me a little about how you got started in this wonderful world of content.
I started with AIIM about 25 years ago, and the focus then was on documents and workflow. And so we migrated the organization to focus more on web-based technologies, and now increasingly on more technologies focused on what we call intelligent information management. So it's been a long journey, a lot of changes, but at the core has always been people, process, and technology.
So Cheryl, you're a Principal Analyst at Forrester Research.
I am.
What does your typical week look like there?
I think the fun part about being an analyst is that no 2 weeks are ever the same. But a big part of my day-to-day work experience is actually talking to our customers, both enterprise customers, vendor customers. So sitting on 30-minute phone calls, we call inquiry, do a lot of research, both qualitative and quantitative. So again, talking to customers, sending out surveys. And then, my passion has always been writing. So get to sit down and write a lot of really interesting content that, helps our customers make better decisions.
How did you come to be part of this wonderful world of content?
Well, I actually started as a history major. I didn't come from a technology background.
Interesting.
And I started to realize through a series of summer jobs doing my master's that the world was going digital. So I kind of pivoted into the technology world just to understand how we're going to be able to preserve and protect a lot of our digital heritage.
And is today the first time you've met John?
No, I've known John for, it's got to be at least 10, maybe more years.
Yes, many more years.
Many more years than that.
So Ian, as Principal Program Manager at Microsoft, although I'm not sure everyone understands what that means in your day-to-day.
Sure. So I sit on the leadership team for SharePoint and OneDrive, and I have three primary functions. The first is working with customers. Second is working with partners. Third is working with analysts. And in my spare time, I'm also Microsoft's representative on the AIIM Board of Directors.
Any history that you want to share with us?
Well, I've started in this industry 20 years ago at a manufacturing organization. I was a customer, warehouser, and I worked on a tool there called Content Services. From there, I went into banking, Washington Mutual, and then JP Morgan Chase. And then I spent a few years working for a competitor of Microsoft's, IBM, also a partner, of course. And then I joined Microsoft a couple of years ago. My history is a long one, 20 years in the industry, and working as a customer, working as a partner / competitor, and now here at Microsoft.
So we talked about enterprise content management, ECM, and that's traditionally the name given to this discipline. But increasingly, we've seen the rise of other terminology, intelligent information management, content services. What do we think is going on there? Is this just a new name for the same process, or is there something really transformative going on at the same time?
Well, I think there's something really transformative going on here. I think when you go back to ECM, it was really conceived in the era in which people were trying to automate very specific document-intensive processes, mission-critical, very complicated processes. And that worked well in that environment. Things like new drug application processes and insurance claim processing and things like that. I would never think of it as a market segment. I would think of it as a description of things that people are trying to do with content and information.
Cheryl, what do you think is going on with the terminologies?
I still use the label to describe, a lot of the traditional vendors and technologies that have been in this market for, again, 10, 15, 20 years in some cases. But I've also been writing quite a lot about this kind of shift from an on-premises suite kind of architecture, which is often hard to customize and configure, into this modern era of content platforms, powered by a range of APIs, content services, and I do like the bringing that concept of intelligence into the mix, though, because I think we are on this kind of brink of bringing a lot of these cognitive services into the world of content management.
So, Ian, I know you've occasionally internally described yourself as an ECM nut. So do you think ECM is still a relevant term, or have you adopted content services to describe what we're going on, or something else?
Well, to some degree, regardless of what I think, it's what our customers think, what our partners think, and so forth. And I'd say there's still confusion in the marketplace in terms of what to call these tools, whether they're content services or ECM or document management or knowledge management or web content management or what have you. And I think to the point John made, it's a set of tools that you use to accomplish something. And I love what AIIM's doing. We're saying the thing that we're trying to accomplish is to intelligently manage our information, or to do intelligent information management. And whether it's content services or ECM or what have you, those are the tools that we use to accomplish that goal.
So I think regardless of whether we're talking about this as a process or as a tool set or as an end result, I think we all agree we're talking about content here. Mm-hmm. But what's interesting is I think there's also been an evolution in what is content and what is not. We've seen more and more things come into modern digital workplaces that were unimaginable 20 years ago. What's content?
That's a good question. It used to be easy. It used to be that content was the unstructured documents that were kind of in contrast to more structured data that was held in rows and columns of a database. And now, two things have occurred. One is that all those lines that existed between structured and unstructured content, if they ever really meant anything to users, are all blurred, and nobody really cares what the difference is. And the kinds of content isn't just document anymore, and it's not just Office files anymore. It can be video, it can be audio, it can be all sorts of different things. And so it has gotten to be, I think actually information that encompasses both data and content is probably a better description of what we're talking about.
Cheryl, what do you think of that?
Yeah, no, I agree. I think there, some of those lines between structured and unstructured are a bit artificial to begin with. I mean, because if you think of a lot of content, there is structure within content. There is metadata. There is even the look and feel of a document. Grammar is structure. So I think we're just getting a little bit smarter about, how do we actually mine and use some of that content, in a structured way. One of the big pain points that I hear customers talk about is, how do I create the right content for different distribution channels and different audiences? So create once but reuse many. I think that's some of the interesting challenges we're going to see in the very near future.
Do you think the document is still going to be as prevalent a format in 20 years?
I think the document will be a prevalent format, but I think the equivalent of a document equals a file is the part that is starting to erode, as we see a lot more of the online and software as a service authoring tools, things that allow a lot of collaboration and co-creation activities. I mean, these aren't often files until we choose to export them.
So Ian, to you, do you think that traditional file management is up to the challenge of dealing with modern or postmodern content?
Well, for traditional files, it probably is, but for that modern content that Cheryl talked about, where you don't have a file unless you choose to export it to another format or something like that, something like a OneNote file or some of the other note-taking tools that are out there in the market, or some of the more modern document generation tools that are in the market, where you don't actually create an artifact. It lives inside of a database somewhere with a bunch of metadata, and you go and collaboratively edit it in a Word or a web browser. I think that becomes harder for managing that content and doing something with it, because it's not a file that you can, squirrel away somewhere into a repository. It's living in where it lives is the repository. So it's definitely a challenge for, I think, everyone in the industry, whether you're on the customer side or partner or on the vendor side.
Yeah, Ian's point about where it lives is the repository, I think, is a really key thing. And that's a key change that's gone on in this marketplace in the last, just in the last 3 or 4 years, really. We used to be very repository-centric, and then we're moving away from that now.
John, you mentioned something, it's as a singularity, the repository, which is interesting. Cheryl, do you think in 10 years organizations will have more or fewer repositories than they have now?
So, I actually wrote a little bit last year about, are we shifting to this, post-repository world, where the repository becomes less and less, the value add of a content management platform. And what's really important is, do we have the connectivity to federate or interoperate so we can pull content from multiple systems, but hide the complexity from the day-to-day information worker and just present what they need to complete a task, through their mobile app or through an alternative line of business application or in their office productivity tool of choice.
So we know being in the cloud has been a trend for years. In Office 365 alone, Microsoft has over 400,000 customers who are using it. Is the cloud truly transformative, or is it just another data center?
Well, I think it's truly transformative, and it certainly has, the perception of the cloud has changed in the minds of customers. We've really gotten to a tipping point in the last couple of years. When we used to survey people 3-4 years ago, and particularly an AIIM audience, which is very focused on control and access to content and information and records,
right.
And we would ask them whether the cloud was part of their strategy. People wouldn't just say no, they would say hell no. And when we look at it now, 82% say when they look at the primary direction of their efforts in the next 2 years, 82% say it's in the direction of either the cloud or a hybrid cloud on-prem strategy. So clearly something has gone on in the minds of customers in terms of the capabilities that the cloud gives them that they want to optimize against.
Don't you find there are also some organizations who try to do exactly the same things in the cloud that they were doing on premises, who'd say the cloud is a big enough change?
I think really what's going on is that people want choice. Even organizations that tend to be biased towards an on-prem approach, they want to have that as an option out there. So having both sets of capabilities, I think, becomes really, really critical moving forward.
So both sets.
Yeah.
Cheryl, do you agree?
I do, actually, and we've got data that shows that the tipping point in terms of having most enterprise content management deployments on premises has now shifted to more hybrid and hosted, moving towards software as a service. So I think this hybrid world is where we're going to be living for the next few years as organizations are at different stages of a roadmap to cloud. I kind of see that we've kind of gone through the fast follower phase, and now we're getting into the critical mass, which is a lot of the larger, regulated, more risk-averse kind of organizations. But even they have roadmap for content and collaboration in the cloud.
So you mentioned a couple of years. Do you think that it's ever a permanent trend to be hybrid?
I think it's going to be here for a few years. Permanent, not necessarily. I think as organizations take a look at what are their more complex content or process management workloads. For example, if they have deep integrations to other on-premises line of business applications, that's a lot tougher to just move into a cloud service overnight, where spinning up a new project team or a new corporate intranet site, that's much easier to do net new, kind of clean slate in a cloud application.
So Ian, have you run across any customers who aren't trying hard enough in the cloud, I guess I'd say?
I'd say from a content management point of view, most of our customers are either in the cloud or moving toward the cloud aggressively. But to Cheryl's point, there are a lot of other systems that they have, their ERP systems and CRM systems and, custom things that they've built in their organizations and so forth that are on-prem and will be on-prem for a long time. And they're struggling with how to move those to the cloud as well. So I think there's at least a fairly long period of time where they will be hybrid and doing hybrid deployments. And I think that those customers are certainly struggling with how they get from on-prem to the cloud. The other thing I would say is the customers that have really heavily customized their on-prem deployments of content management tools, ripped out the code that was provided by the vendor and written their own code, their own UIs, their own integration points and so forth. They tend to struggle the most because, oftentimes moving to the cloud, you can't necessarily change all the code that's in the SaaS offering that's provided by the vendor.
I think of it as a customization paradox. I've been working with SharePoint for almost 20 years. And organizations would sometimes go in and heavily customize on-premises environments, understanding that it put them at risk of not being able to complete an upgrade. And most of those organizations, in my experience, have moved to the cloud, and they're upgrade-free in the cloud, right? Regardless of who the provider is, Microsoft or anyone else, it's on the provider to take care of that. But I think organizations sometimes are questioning, did we ever need all those customizations in the first place? Maybe sometimes we're better off just running the service as it is.
Yeah, customizations die hard.
Yeah.
And there's a long tail in most organizations when it comes to changing core hardwired things, because of exactly what Ian referred to. It's difficult, it's hard, there's a lot of interconnections, there's a lot of work that's gone into it, a lot of ownership by people in some of those systems. And so while the direction is toward the cloud, the speed at which that occurs, I think, depends a lot on the particular environment that people are in.
And I think it really goes a long way in terms of helping solve kind of the perennial challenge in the content management space around user adoption. Because so many of the historical deployments have been on premises, highly customized, they are hard to upgrade.
So we're talking about some, fear and reluctance, or even fear and loathing about the cloud.
Fear, uncertainty, and doubt.
Right. That's a wonderful technology term. But with that, I think there still are legitimate reasons why organizations need to keep some of their uses and some of their content on premises. What are some of the good ones that each of you have heard?
I certainly work with a lot of organizations where they have performance considerations. Maybe their internet connectivity isn't what it needs to be. And if they're working with particularly large files, they're geographically dispersed and so forth, they need local caches and so forth. So that can be one. I think there's also some governance and compliance reasons. In some cases, some of the cloud vendors are not certified with all of the certifications quite yet that they need. And so there may be something obscure at a state level or a municipality level that requires them to keep something on-prem.
When I talk to some public sector, government agencies and highly regulated agencies, especially, if we look into Europe, for example, if they don't have the confidence that they've got a local vendor that can provide, in-country data residency requirements for sensitive information, then they'll often choose to stay on premises until they have that comfort.
The security kinds of things that Cheryl talked about, and particularly the data residency side, as that gets more and more complex over time and as geographies step in to, put their brand on where they want data to be, that becomes another issue why some people say, well, in this case, we'll keep it on-prem.
And John, to that data residency point, we just see that all the time where clients and partners feel like, oh, we can store stuff in a particular region and we'll be compliant with the law, not realizing that the processing, the indexing, the support staff, the network routing of it when you actually retrieve things and so forth leaves that geography, right? The databases are stored back in the US and the indexing is back in the US, but the storage is, in Germany, for instance, right? And so that's certainly something that we would, encourage everyone to be aware of when they're really thinking about data residency, to look at it from the whole picture, not just where the hard drives are, but where the service is operated from, where the processing is, the indexing, and so forth.
So GDPR has recently gone into effect in the European Union. And it reminds me in many regards of some of the focus nearly 20 years ago on Y2K, that there's both risk and opportunity with something like GDPR. Cheryl, what do you see as some of the advantages to the organization of having to comply with GDPR?
Well, I think first off, it kind of compels organizations to really understand their end-to-end content and data holdings. Build out that map so they know where any kind of risky content might reside, or any other employee or customer confidential information. Where does it actually reside, and can we retrieve it, secure it, and potentially even destroy or disclose it, depending on the requests. What's been fascinating to me is that a lot of the customer interest I've had under this banner of GDPR has been less around the content sitting in their neat and tidy content or records management systems, but what's out there on the Wild West of things like our network drive, our file shares, the things we haven't looked at in a couple of years. That's where a lot of kind of the angst and the fear resides right now.
I think that's a really important point. We're a little tiny organization. We're 25 people, but it's really gotten us to think about, when you start with that consent process on the front end, and then you start to ask yourself, okay, well, why are we asking for this information, and what do we really need in order to fulfill the customer expectation on the other end? It's very different than those long, gigantic forms that we typically put on top of content. And so it's changed, I think, the expectation about what we ask and how much we ask and why we ask it and all those kinds of questions.
Yeah, Forrester's had a very kind of strong research stream the last number of years around overall customer experience. And so I've really taken that to heart when I think about things like information governance. And I think GDPR is probably the classic great example of the power now of the customer, the consumer, the citizen, in terms of the expectations they can put on their suppliers and vendors and agencies they deal with, in terms of, well, how are you going to use the information I give you? How are you going to protect it, share it, potentially dispose of it as well? So it's a great kind of model for that, taking an outside-in perspective on even how do you set up your information governance kind of stakeholder team.
And we found it to be a good learning tool, too, just internally, in terms of, helping all the people in the organization understand exactly why we're doing the things that we do and how we go about doing it, and try to protect our customers along the way.
And it strikes me that GDPR has so many analogies to e-discovery and that type of domain, because now it's essentially, if John wants to know all the information that a company has about him and he's a European citizen, we have to do the equivalent of an e-discovery search to find all the information about John. But instead of doing it for a court case, we're now doing it to provide to John so that he knows what we have about him and so forth. So there's a lot of places where you can leverage some of the same learnings and technologies and so forth, I think, to help you be compliant with GDPR.
And it's not an insignificant undertaking at scale. The survey that I did, basically people came back and said, on average, they thought it would cost 4,800 euro to find all the information about a customer and deliver it in machine-readable format back to that customer. Well, you start multiplying that times the number of requests that people are going to get, and it really puts an incentive on people to get serious about how they manage their information.
When you look at the industry, certainly Microsoft is not alone in using AI and cognitive services to help enrich the entire part of the content experience. Do we think that this is going to become something that is not just prevalent, but pervasive and noticeable, or something that becomes a background service that we just take for granted, like printing? How do you see AI shaping?
I think all we can really say for certain is that AI and machine learning is really going to help us on the age-old problem that we've had in terms of understanding what content is and understanding it in terms of the meaning of the content, not just static data fields and things like that. Mm-hmm. And I think it's going to open up all sorts of opportunities to integrate content into business processes in ways that we never could do before, because we could never find the right content to interject into that business process.
I hope that it just feels like magic and it's wonderful. I want it to just be like, wow, my search results are incredibly relevant today. And hey, that's exactly the document that I needed. I don't want it to feel awkward and forced that a machine did something for me. I want it to feel pleasant and nice and magical. And I think that's one of the places that here in the infancy of it, it's pretty clear when it's AI, and it's especially clear when it's AI and it gets something wrong, right? Yeah. And so,
I mean, I get a lot of demos from a lot of vendors and consultants, and we always see like the picture tagging as a great example, and that's interesting and it's cool. But like Ian said, I mean, the usefulness in terms of smarter recommendations in terms of what I should read in preparation for a meeting, because it's been able to detect signals from my calendar, being able to even do things like automated translation. Just think about the accessibility grounds that can open up in terms of sharing content with teams in other lands, speaking other languages, who use various assistive devices. Suddenly we can turn this content into readable text. We can turn it into other languages. I mean, I think we're just scratching the surface in terms of going beyond just automated metadata tagging into really interesting new collaborative ways of working.
Even though it seems like we've been doing it forever, when it comes to sub-processes, is really in its very early stages.
Right.
And so you think about something like robotic process automation, for example. And right now, a lot of RPA engines are somewhat like the Roomba machine that you set out on the rug, and it kind of runs, and then it like crashes into a chair leg and it can't go there, and it crashes into a rug and it can't go there, and it crashes into a table leg and it can't do there. And that's what happens lots of times with these engines when they bump up against content. Right now, and it's because they're not content is not necessarily machine language friendly right now, and I think automation and artificial intelligence is going to pave the way for that and make those engines much more powerful in the future.
I think we even see this in the structured world. The one I always love to joke about is did you know 100% of your customers in Boston are also in Massachusetts? Right? Thanks for the insight, nebulous cloud thinker. But I do think that there's also a risk, that the more we see machine-generated content and machine-interpreted content, what is the role of the information worker? Is it just to train a model to do our job and get out of the way?
There's certainly some, maybe less on the creation side and more on the enriching and improving and proofing and so forth side as you generate content with AI and machine learning. And then I think from a compliance perspective, there will still, at least for a good period of time, need to be some double checking that happens and so forth. Even though if I give John and Cheryl and you all the same set of images, you all classify them differently, and a machine won't do that necessarily. There still needs to be some human factor for a while to kind of double check and make sure that things are accurate and make sense, right?
I think on a trite level, we say sometimes, well, of course, it's going to open up the opportunity for people to do higher order things and more important things and free them from the drudgery of everyday work. And all of that is true. It's also going to occur in the context of some degree of disruption in terms of how jobs are defined. And that's just a reality, I think, as we move into this, in the same way that any other significant technology innovation in the past, whether it was steam or electricity or television or radio or any of that, changed the nature of work. And we're in that mode right now, I think, the very beginnings in terms of the impact of machine learning and artificial intelligence on jobs.
And I think we also are going to bump up against, kind of some of the contradictions in terms of how we have managed information over the last couple of decades. I mean, for organizations with very aggressive retention and disposal policies from a records management perspective, I mean, they're missing huge swaths of what could be potential useful signals and sources to be mined as part of this. So you're just keeping kind of a small subset of the records because it's less expensive to do e-discovery. You're also missing a big chunk of your corporate memory that could actually contribute to some of the findings and analysis. And think about organizations with still large paper stores. If you can go back 10 years in terms of digital contracts for your customers, great. Well, what if you can go back 50? Because you've actually been able to digitize and extract information that can lead to more intelligent decisions going back over longer periods of time because you've done that conversion. So
compliance and records management and retention have long been pillars of how we manage information at scale, on premises or in the cloud. How do you see that as a discipline evolving over the next 10 years?
Well, I think that there's a lot of opportunity, as we just talked about, moving into, more of using the algorithms, understanding what is the right kind of algorithm to do different kinds of categorization, classification. I think that these roles, because they're often subject matter experts in their particular lines of businesses, they understand the corporate taxonomy, how have they been using things like metadata, could be in a very good position to be, kind of the trainers of the algorithms going forward, rather than just the retainers of the records.
We kind of find that in terms of, we do a lot of training on electronic records management at AIIM, and we find that the largest segment of people that take those courses are records managers, which says to me that there's a segment of the records management profession that is working very hard to upgrade their skills and could, in effect, be kind of like a translator or an intervener or a connecting device between the business, the technology, and the records function that perhaps we've been missing in the past.
I think there's an intense need for simplification as well. I think we over-pivoted, or the pendulum swung a little too far in the Sarbanes-Oxley days, and large organizations that no longer exist because they kept things longer than they should, or what have you. And it just feels like there's this need for simplification and to streamline the process, make it easier. But I think there's also a need, just generally speaking, to say maybe we'll accept what we think is a little bit more risk by simplifying this and doing big buckets or what have you. But in reality, it's not more risk than having something that's so complicated that nobody follows it.
So if you think about what's going on now with cloud content management as a second wave or a second opportunity for records management, how do we as practitioners and how does the industry as a whole make sure that we don't repeat the risk that our records archives become the warehouse where documents go to die?
Yeah, I think one element of that, which AIIM has been involved in for a long time, is training and education and certification in terms of understanding the environment that you operate in and the best practices associated with it. And so I think one of the challenges that we at AIIM have is, okay, how do you take a lot of those practices that were traditionally defined in an on-prem world and migrate those into a cloud environment so that people don't make the same mistakes they made the first time? Because you're right. We've all seen cloud implementations that turned into just glorified instances of the file share. It's just a horrible dumping ground of junk. And that's not where you really want to get to.
I think that we didn't quite get there in the on-premises world because it was too expensive to go back and index the billions and tens of billions and hundreds of billions of documents that I had. I didn't have the compute capacity to do that and so forth. I think the cloud will open that door up with the scalability and the compute capacity that you have in the cloud to actually go back and relook at that and make some intelligent suggestions around these are things that you should get rid of because no one in the organization has touched this for 2 decades. Right? It might be able to be, at least archived somewhere and possibly even, let's talk crazy, maybe you could delete it. Yep. So I think there's an opportunity there. I don't think we got there on-prem because it was just too expensive to go back through and look at all that content.
And I think it also opens the door, in addition to all of the scale performance advantages, especially at large scale, the ability to have that information more broadly accessible, shareable by other parts of the organization, even by members of what I often have been calling the extended enterprise. So you've got critical suppliers, partners, even customers can benefit from that information, and trying to share that securely in on-prem systems can be much more difficult than if you can open up a door to certain segments of your cloud content management.
I was listening to some interesting research about 2 things to rethink with records management. One is that records management isn't a flag. It's a score that varies over the life cycle of information. And the second is that we're not reusing it sufficiently to inform our search and our relevance indexes. The fact that something this is the permanent record of this might mean I should pay more attention to it instead of burying it. I don't know, I think it's interesting.
And I think your word life cycle is really a critical and neglected element in terms of how we manage these information assets.
So looking forward, there's obviously been a lot of innovation that's come up in the last few years, as well as things that are likely to come up in the next few years. What's something that excites you about the next 10 years? Something you've seen or that you really can't wait to see that we as an industry get it right?
I can remember when you would try to train train computers to understand what you were saying, and you would say things like Sissel 6, and it would come out in, in a million different permutations and combinations, despite having read War and Peace into the engine to start with. And that's changing dramatically. And so, when you start to think about 5 years from now, how are people going to interface with our content systems? How are they going to interface with processes? What are millennials going to expect in terms of an interface? Are they really going to be sitting there typing into a laptop? Going to change a lot. And I think it's going to be really exciting to see what happens there.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Just the opening of new ways of creating and generating that content to begin with, including using AI services to generate news articles, summaries. I mean, it sounds a little bit crazy, but this concept of knowledge management has come roaring back with a vengeance in the customer calls I've had over the last few months. And I've referred to this as kind of information FOMO, that fear of missing out, because they know this stuff exists. They just don't know how to get to it, where it resides. And I think the opportunity to kind of mine into multiple systems, structured or unstructured, it really kind of opens up the door to new ways of knowledge delivery to people who are really thirsting for insights. The thing that terrifies me also is this area of digital preservation. And John, I know you've been talking about this, but I just think that we are underestimating the fragility of a lot of our digital artifacts. Are we going to be able to look at this, preserve it, access it in 10, 15, 50 years down the road? This is my historian hat coming back out. But also even things, tactical like link rot, right? We rely on online information so often. We embed links in our email and our documents. And, there's some data out there that shows if you look at scientific legal journals, a third of that is already dead links. So we really need to think about this stuff.
There was something I read once about, they were predicting 100 years from now, there'll be 2 kinds of digital archaeologists, hard and soft. The soft will be experts in missing file formats. The hard ones will tell you how to make that BlackBerry work again.
So when I think 10 years out, I'd combine the 2 things. John talking about voice and new ways to interact, and Cheryl talking about knowledge management and preserving that knowledge. I think we're quickly heading down a path where you've got embedded and wearable devices and so forth, not just me wearing one on my wrist, but much more interesting use cases there. Elon Musk and many of the other leaders in the industry are looking at brain interfaces to computers and so forth. So being able to interact in new ways, whether it's voice, whether it's something wearable, whether it's something implantable, and then having access to all that information, I think that's going to just completely change again the way things work. That's not going to happen next year or 2 years or 5 years, something that's coming.
I mean, think about a 10-year horizon is that we didn't have an iPhone.
Just barely had iPhones 10 years ago, exactly.
And so it's like, 10 years is a long time and it's accelerating rates of change.
Exactly.
I don't think the stuff you're talking about is unrealistic at all.
Yep.
Well, I just wanted to say thank you very much for joining us here today. This has been a really interesting and educational conversation for me, and I hope for those of you watching out there. Once again, I'd like to also thank John Mancini.
Thanks for having me, Chris.
Cheryl McKinnon. And Ian Story.
Great to be here.
Please keep watching for more information here from Microsoft. Thank you.